For me personally, I wanted to do this documentary, yes, to tell my story, but really to open up doors, right? And here we are at Sundance. And hopefully this is just a moment where you're gonna see more women's docs, more women's sports docs, getting the looks that they've always deserved, but sometimes you just need that one person to set the scene, and that would be the Robin.
That's a great segue to a question that I had for Jay and Emily about sort of the sports doc space. That has really exploded, I think, especially since The Last Dance. And I'm wondering if you could talk about, one, what you think is driving that level of interest, and two, if you as producers have any concern about sort of like market saturation.
Actually, I think it really starts with 30 for 30, really, right? And then you have Last Dance where you see it in the feature, well, in a series format. But I haven't think about this about Sue, like, and again, the WNBA at large, even using Sue's story, we think we know, but we don't. The reality is, like, we really only know the proximity, we really only know Sue and the WNBA kind of at large, kind of because of its proximity, to the NBA. And we don't really know these athletes. And we look, they're on such a pedestal, and the way they train and how they carry themselves and all the opportunities they create outside of basketball for themselves and for others. But we want to peek at the magic, if you will, and like how they do it and what it takes to be able to do that and what it means to sacrifice, right? And what it means to like get up every single day and work and be a teammate and be a partner and be a business person, like all of these things that come with that. And I think there's a lot of inspiration there, and it's not made up. Like, these are real people and real stories. And so I think that's why we find ourselves so drawn to these sports figures, because they're so inspirational.
And in terms of saturation, I think there are, first of all, there are so many themes that you can get into through it with each athlete's story, right? So in terms of our film, it's very much about the trajectory of women's sports over the last 20 years. And with regards to that and finding our voice within women's sports, we are certainly not at a saturation point. We are at the starting point. There is far less representation of women's voices in sports, and way more ground to cover with that.
Sarah, I'm wondering, when you're making a documentary, especially, you sort of like get so immersed in the world of your subject, and it inevitably sort of changes how you view that subject. What was your sort of impression of Sue going in? And how has that understanding been transformed by spending so much time together, and then also getting to go back to all this wealth of archival material from her life?
To be honest, going in, I was not actually a fan of basketball. I didn't watch men's or women's. So the way that I got into this was through character. And for me, once I started learning about Sue and researching about her career and her life, I was just blown away. I was blown away why her name wasn't a household name. I just couldn't believe the achievements that she had, achieved over the course of her career. And then it was all the other things that started coming from that about the experience of being a female athlete, the sexism, the lack of resources, the lack of value, the lack of investment, all of those things that sort of spoke to much larger themes for women athletes, but also I think for women at large, So that is what really got me into it, and yeah, that sort of changed me. And now, of course, I am a basketball fan. And I'm very proud to say that it's the women's game that got me into the men's game as well. I follow two teams, so Seattle Storm, of course. They're always going to be the first, and New York Liberties. So shout out to those two teams.
I, like you, sort of came to the project with a casual understanding of the WNBA, and I think one of the strengths of the film is the step back to show things like the pay disparity with the NBA, the pressure, the financial pressure to play overseas, the fight for the new CBA with protections for maternity leave, etc. And yet I found out from our sports editor that the WNBA players still have to fly commercial. And I'm wondering, do you think that's soon in the offing that the league would charter flights for players? And in addition to that, like, what are some of the other issues that you see the league needing to tackle next on this path toward equity?
Yeah, I mean, commercial flights, charter flights are such an interesting topic because it's a lot of money, right? There's actually not that many people that charter in the world. Yet, I think in sports, in professional sports in our country, it is this benchmark for people who are maybe casual fans. It does represent something. So with that, I think everyone in the WNBA, myself included, we understand that that is where we want to get because that does give us some sort of validation. We also understand there's a lot that needs to be done in order to achieve that. On our side, we have to continue to show up, play, be entertainers, perform, fight for the things. But on the other side, we need brand investment. You know, Sarah touched on some of these things. You need brand investment, corporate sponsorship. But the thing that I'm so excited about, and I really think it'll be, you know, I speak of benchmarks, this is going to be another benchmark, is the media deal that we have coming up. Our media deal runs out in the next year or two. I'm sure negotiations have already begun, and that is really going to put us in a different category financially. And then we're going to see higher salaries, right? And there is a difference. Right now, the max salary is $250,000. That's pretty good. For some reason, because we get compared to the men, it doesn't look so great. I don't know why. $250,000 sounds great to me. But with this new media deal, you might see salaries that are $500,000, $1 million. And then all of a sudden narratives change, people look at us different, they start taking note, and then everything falls into place, including those coveted chartered flights.
Qualitatively, what would you want to see from that media deal in terms of like what the coverage actually looks like, what games are shown and where? What would be the sort of dream scenario to come out of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily, you know, historically all of our partners have done a great job of, you know, putting the right games on at the right time, with some exceptions here and there. I think if we start at the back, which is like at the end, which is the playoffs, I'd love to see all the playoff games on, you know, whatever network we end up on like the main channel, right? There's been times with our partnership with ESPN where some of the games have ended up on ESPN News or ESPNU. So that's definitely one thing I think tangible that I could say. Otherwise, I would love to see an investment around like pre-game shows, post-game shows, because covering the game has been pretty great. If you turn on a game, yeah, could we have some more camera angles? Absolutely. When you turn on a game, you're getting really good quality. But I'd love to have a pregame show. Let's talk about the storylines. Let's talk about the two teams playing. Let's talk about how so-and-so got injured yesterday and what's going to happen, or this one just had a baby. And, you know, like all the different storylines that WNBA players bring. I'd love to talk about that, both pre and post-game and halftime, because that is a part of what connects fans to us as players and really moves the needle.
Yeah, and it builds that sort of narrative between playoff games. Who's rising, who's falling, that sort of thing. That kind of almost talk radio sensibility is what sports fans are into when there's not a game on.
Exactly. Yeah, and you're building that mythology too, right. You know, and that's what I wanted this film to do. It was like Sue is a huge part of that mythology in women's basketball, and so this was a way of like enshrining that as you know, a really important part of that piece. And then hopefully, you know, there will just be more and more stories that get built upon after this.
Jay and Emily. Jay, I spotted you out of the corner of my eye on courtside at the semifinal game against Vegas that they unfortunately lost. So you obviously were a fan. I wonder if you and Emily could just sort of talk about your relationship with the WNBA, sort of how you got into it and who you support.
Yeah, I mean, I remember getting into it when it first started. Like, I remember Lisa Leslie and Rebecca Lobo and that whole like class of Cheryl Swoops, like that whole class of like, when the league started, and just being like, oh, this is new and this is fresh. I'm gonna back up, Sue has heard this story. I also played high school basketball with a woman named Isis Tillis who played in the WNBA. So I knew of a very high level basketball player who went on to play at Duke, I believe, yeah, and then obviously had a W career. And so I knew of high level, and she was the ticket in our city, by the way, in a city that had a lot of guys that went to go play college basketball and some that even made it to the league. Watching Isis was the ticket. And so I remember when the W started and I was like, oh, this is more of, at a higher level even now, but this is more of what I've already gotten to watch in high school. And so I've always been a fan, and I've always been a stan of Sue, like her entire career, from UConn, or even when I first heard about her at Christ the King, all the way through to her last few years in Seattle. So yeah.
And I grew up playing basketball and watching basketball and going to basketball games, and you know, we didn't have the WNBA yet when I was growing up, and I too so connected with the Dream Team. I mean, that to me was this pivotal moment where we could see where this could go, where there might be a future for women in sports and women playing basketball professionally. But still, like my high school gym, my basketball team played in the smaller gym and the boys team was in the bigger gym, and they traveled differently. We just, the scene was very totally different. And when you watch the film and go through Sue's story, it's really emblematic of where we've come, and in 20 years, where that equity is now and how far it still has to go.
I had a quick question about sort of how you handle Shabtai's assassination. I wonder if there was any consideration of addressing Brittany Griner's ordeal as you discuss the sort of dangers and challenges of playing overseas, since that was sort of unfolding as you were shooting.
Yeah, it absolutely was. I mean, there's, you know, it was such, you know, a terrible situation. And in some of the interviews, I did actually ask people about that. But I felt like it wasn't connected directly to Sue's story for that particular time. You know, Russia, for me, the way that or the lens I was looking at it was through Sue's experience of that at that time. Now, obviously today it's very, very different. And, you know, I certainly could have, you know, chosen to put that in as a comparison. But there was a part of that story for me that I felt like what happened to her was just so horrible, and I felt very sort of sensitive about that. This is her story to tell at the right time in the way that she wants to, and I wasn't the person to do that, you know, not in this film. I wanted to really keep it in this lane about Sue and her career and her life. So it was absolutely there. I mean, it's unavoidable, but that was why I chose to leave it out.
Thank you. One last question for you, Sue. So what struck me is that very early in the film, you ask sort of the camera / yourself, what am I if I'm not a basketball player? How would you answer that question now after having gone through this process? Is there a career in media or entertainment ahead for you think?
Well, the actual answer is what I have found is I'm still the same person, right? And a lot of the skills that I developed through sport, developed through basketball, through all of my experience there, I can take with me into these other places, these other avenues. Obviously, we all know I do have a production company, a Touch More, a media company together. I just joined Deep Blue, which is a sports entertainment forum that really focuses on media buying, which is more like businessy stuff. But I am hosting a show called Sue's Places and the Peyton's Places family. So as you can see, I'm dipping my toe everywhere. And really what I'm seeing is, you know, what am I if I'm not a basketball player? I'm actually just still the same person. All of me is showing up in all of those rooms as I start to figure out I guess who I am in terms of what career path I'm going to take. But I don't know, I think I'm just going to take all of them.